Well, welcome to the panel today. My name is Lexa, and I'm in the Environment and Sustainability team at Hatch. I'm based in London, but I work regionally across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Hatch is a global engineering firm headquartered in Canada, and we are based here in the UAE in Abu Dhabi. We're also active across the Africa, Europe, and Middle East region. We employ over 11,000 engineers worldwide, and we support the development of infrastructure, and we work extensively in the energy, mining, and metal sectors. So today, I would like to introduce our panel. First, we have Roy Debus, who has over 26 years of professional experience in the global energy, mining, and minerals industries. He has been based in the UAE for over 15 years, and currently he's the regional director for Hatch in the Middle East and North Africa region. Next, we have Charles Naibez, who is a mining engineer, and he is currently the VP of Business Development for the Center of Excellence in Mining and Innovation, and he is the Network Director for the Mining Innovation Commercialization Accelerator Network based in Canada. Next, we have Jean-Denis Carrier, who is our Global Aluminum and Alliances Director for Hatch. He has been based here in the UAE region for 17 years, and he's worked to promote Hatch's portfolio here in the region as well as North Africa. Finally, the panel today will be moderated by Karen Dingley. Karen is a civil engineer, and she is primarily focused on the integrated water resource management, infrastructure, and mining throughout the world. Karen is our regional director for ESG across the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region.
Thank you, Alexa. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to our panelists today. Our discussion today is really sort of thinking to some extent around the social ramifications of some of our net zero ambitions and some of the challenges and that we're seeing with respect to innovating with respect to decarbonisation. Certainly the social ramifications of not acting with respect to climate change are very well known, but equally we do an awful lot of work in developing countries and with underprivileged communities, and in those areas there are some social ramifications where our industrial global push for net zero are coming to bear. Certainly sort of access to affordable energy, in some instances more tangible impacts associated with changing in income, where we're sort of lacking the ability to mine fossil fuels and use fossil fuels. Here at COP, we're seeing both the Emirati and the Canadian governments investing quite a lot of money in pushing funds for underprivileged and developing communities that are impacted by climate change, and also just encouraging the sort of transition towards net zero. And also, I think, watching governments putting in mechanisms to try and drive capital investment into decarbonisation technologies, which is fantastic. But certainly industry has a key role to play as well, and we'd like to sort of talk through some of those opportunities and potential challenges today. So for our first question, certainly the UN Race to Zero, we have around 11,000 organisations that have signed up on the UN Race to Zero and that have taken the pledge. But certainly I think it's widely seen that the trajectory isn't necessarily changing in the speed in which we want it to. So maybe, Charles, if I could ask you initially, I mean, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing facing industry in relation to the development and implementation of decarbonisation technologies?
Okay, thank you, Karen, for the question. So the mining industry has a lot of challenges, and I think when it comes to decarbonisation, there's maybe a few areas that are worth highlighting. Number one, our industry is a high energy intensity industry. You know, most of our processes, when you're liberating rock from its metal from its host rock, you need a lot of energy. Comminution is really the word that we use in the industry. So when you look at all the smelting processes, it's really high energy intensity. There are some processes that we currently use high energy where we haven't really figured out another way of doing things. For example, when it comes to aluminum, processes that we use are just high energy intensity. There's no alternative to do it. So another area that I want to mention is that it's very expensive to do anything meaningful in the mining industry. So it's high capital intensity. Lots of investments is required to actually put in place the components that can help the industry decarbonize. Then there's technological limitations where, you know, historically we've always done things a certain way, and there's just no alternative technologies in place. So there are some technological limitations when it comes to mining. The other area I want to mention is that infrastructure, that there is no infrastructure in some remote areas that can allow you to put in any decarbonization strategies, you know, whether it be you want to put in renewables or whether you want to put in an alternative way of powering a mine. Some mines are just diesel powered only. There is no, you know, grid connectivity. There's no nuclear. Wind and solar are not going to provide you all the power you need. So infrastructure can be a big limitation. Another area too, which is maybe the bigger area, is just regulatory challenges, the regulations that are in place. Some regulations are not going to change overnight, but we need to decarbonize tomorrow. So we need to play catch-up game, you know, making sure regulations are kind of caught up with where the industry is. And I think I'm going to leave it at that for now, and pass it over to Jean Denis.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. And maybe just as you said, I think I'm going to use the example of the aluminum industry because it's close to my heart. But you know, the processes that we're using are, you know, have been developed during the first industrialization, and they're still the ones that we're having today. So it's quite difficult, I guess, to change, you know, just the chemical reactions that have been proven to be so successful for 100 years or more. The industry is working towards it, but sometimes it just takes time. You know, it's fundamental research that is required to go into it, and the results are results, but it takes time to make it commercially viable and socially viable and economically viable for everybody. So, you know, with the right, as you mentioned, with the right incentives, with the right social pressure to move forward. With governments putting in the right frameworks to make sure that the companies and the population is rightly incentivized, then we are starting to see results, but it just takes time sometimes. What did you want to ask?
No, great. And I think, yeah, to your point on incentives, I think when we're looking at specific decarbonization technologies, whether it's carbon capture or other types of new technologies, those that framework and even pricing on carbon is critical. So I think that's an excellent point. The other thing that even for technologies that exist now that we know are practical solutions for decarbonization, they're still very much in their infancy from the point of view that, you know, from a technology development life cycle, they've been developed, but there's still a large cost associated for the first of a kind cost for some of these technologies. They're not, they haven't been developed widespread. So whoever's going to be the first person to put it in is going to have to pay a larger cost than maybe somebody 10 years from now who's put it in. If we look at the perspective of how solar power is currently being developed right now, the cost of installing solar now compared to 20 years ago is an absolute fraction of the cost. And for a lot of these decarbonization technologies, we need some of those incentives and things in place to help those first of a kind costs get through the door. And if we hear a lot of the discussion around COP, it's all around trying to get the investment in place to try and help some of those developers who are trying to move forward with some of those technologies. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think there's been an awful lot of sort of general broad discussion around decarbonisation technologies, innovative technologies. I wonder, could we just unpick a little bit what we mean by those? Some examples of some of the emerging decarbonisation technologies that we're so actively seeing, and also I think just reflecting a little on what is how do they practically apply, and how might they influence the developing world in particular? JD, maybe if I could ask you first.
Sure. You know, I think in our case at Hatch, and you know, we're involved across a broad range of mining commodities. So we see a lot of it, technologies that aim to save water. We were talking about it just before. In my case as well, I'm I would say, a big promoter of electrification of metallurgical smelting. I think a lot of it is done through carbon reaction processes at the moment, and electrification can help reduce the carbon emissions. And these are big investments. They're quite the capital investment cycle on these smelters are long. But I think if we can electrify, we can and then support electrification with renewable energies, then we can actually effectively decarbonize very hard to abate systems. And I think on the social aspect, which was to your question, a lot of communities will only give buy-in to these large capex investment if they feel that that these investments match their values, not only in terms of carbon emission, but also waste effluence, successful employment conditions for local communities, which is one that we see always in Africa at the moment. So I think technologies will help in social acceptance, and it will help also in the monitoring of actually mining and metals businesses, which is very important. The monitoring will help give transparency. Transparency will help with social acceptance. So I think that's where we invest a lot of time and effort in.
Thank you for that. Just to pick up on that theme of electrification, one of the biggest areas for the mining industry right now is the integration of battery electric vehicles in the mining operations for moving material, moving people around, for moving supplies around. You'll find even, the machines that are being used to just move people from point A to point B are now starting to also become battery electric. So that is a huge, huge shift in the mining industry to go electric for sure. The other piece too is that whole renewal integration, where you're starting to see mine sites have solar panels, wind generation, where they're maybe using the wind and the solar to either create hydrogen, which then gets stored and then gets used afterwards. So there's a lot of that's happening. Other interesting ones too for mining, people using spent mine sites to do things like gravity storage, which is an interesting one. I don't think there's any in Canada yet, but there's something like that. Another area too is automation and digitalization. What's happening with automation is that we are actually starting to see how we can better optimize our existing facilities so that they're more efficient. There's a lot of wastage in the mining industry because of that lack of automation and digitalization. So because of that now, machine learning and AI, we're able to get more bang out of the energy that we have available. And then obviously there's emerging technologies on the carbon capture and storage area, where we are able to see mines storing carbon in tailings, for example. So that's another trend that's important. And then another one that's coming up that I personally like is the whole idea around using biotechnology for processes that used to take a lot of energy. So you got bioleaching technologies, microbes are being discovered that chew up all kinds of minerals and metals. And that's really reducing that cost. Now, on the developing world side, I would say, one of the biggest opportunities for us is or challenges that technology transfer is some of the developing countries don't have the skill sets to support a new technology. So that could be a huge challenge when you're trying to bring a new technology to an area that doesn't have that foundation for the technology. And then another area too is that in developing countries, they need to see developing countries demonstrate technologies, put together the best practices, then they can maybe then adopt in that way as well. Pass it to you, Roy.
Yeah. Excellent points, and I might want to echo some of the points you made first before jumping off. I mean, if we look at carbon capture sequestration, technologies exist for a long time for capturing carbon, but one of the largest implementations of carbon capture, there was just a lack of understanding of operators even knowing how to manage the facility when they were given to it after construction. And you had a case where the cost, the online dates, the ramp up of those facilities took years just because the local operations team had very little skill set to handle that specific type of technology. So it is something that Western world or developing world, we have to focus on making sure technologies have a very good operational readiness plan in advance as well. But that's kind of a very important point that you brought up as well. With respect to mines and as well, making sure from electrifications as well as bringing in very good practice from AI and others, we're seeing a lot of mines being designed to help electric vehicles charge when they're, even the slopes of the ramps that the trucks are going down, helping them to actually begin to charge as they go down and have enough battery to come back up the slope. So the designs are improving slowly. So it's also an excellent point. I think the only thing that I would add is just that around some of the hard to abate sectors, there are some other emerging technologies that are going through. Hatch has a few technologies as well. Most of the world's iron ore has to go through a blast furnace route, which is the highest emitting route that you could take iron and steel through currently. And there are technologies that exist that you can take it through a far more carbon reduced route, or a lower carbon route. Most of the iron and steel facilities in the Gulf are all DRI facilities, which use a significant less amount of carbon. In fact, it's quite easy to capture carbon off of DRI facilities. The Emirates Steel facility here in the UAE captures carbon and sends it out to the ADNOC oil fields to get sequestered or used in enhanced oil recovery. So taking a DR route is a much better, which is a direct reduced iron route for breaking down. So there are technologies that exist that are being progressed to take that 85% of the iron ore in the world and take it away from a blast furnace route and take it into a DR route. So beyond just carbon capture and some of the other electrification, there are some specific technologies in some of these hard to abate routes, industries that are being developed that are very exciting and could be game changers here in the near future as well.
Fabulous, thank you. And actually, we had a very interesting sort of brief discussion with the Premier of Alberta a little earlier, and so we were reflecting on how we define innovation. And in an actual fact, I think there's an awful lot of maybe not tried and tested technologies, but new technologies in parts of the world that maybe we're not using particularly well elsewhere in the world. And so innovation, potentially is just sharing technology as opposed to sort of developing new technology. So I think we sort of touched briefly on some of the challenges of decarbonisation and just sort of working in hard to abate industries in the developing world. Certainly access to energy, access to water, infrastructure, all sort of known difficulties. Can I just gauge your thoughts? I mean, what role does government play in terms of overcoming some of these challenges? And by that, I mean both sort of the international governments that could potentially influence what's going on in the developing world, but also then the national governments in some of these regions. Roy, if I could perhaps hand over to you initially.
Sure. So I think government has a strong role to play, especially given the fact that these the costs, as I said earlier, associated with some of the developments around these technologies and some of these innovations are quite significant, especially when they're early on their infancy, and some of them are going to have to go through many trials, scale-ups, and demonstrations. And I think some of the framework that you've seen in the EU and Canada and in the US and some of the incentive programs have helped to fast track, especially, some of the deadlines that we've put on ourselves, and we should push ourselves for these deadlines are quite aggressive. And if you want to try to meet those, you need to accelerate some of these technologies a lot quicker. And so you've seen that work in some of these developed countries. And so I think if we're looking at developed countries, or even in some of the Western countries that don't have some of the framework in place, I think the government has to play a role, whether it's through PPP programs, whether through incentivized programs. There has to be some mechanism to help it. And even if it's sometimes just bringing in a let's call it an open IP idea for some of the technologies that are being developed, which is hard sometimes because when people are putting a lot of their own innovation into things, they don't want to open it up. But even some of the lessons learned in the early days of carbon capture after the Kyoto protocols, there was a lot of establishment of shared knowledge in the CCUS space, for example. And a lot of that shared knowledge helped to advance a lot of the different capture technologies that were developed. People were still able to maintain their IP at the end of the day when technologies were developed, but to help get over a specific hump, sharing that information helps. So even things as small as that can help. But as we're seeing now, any types of incentives that help with capital injection are always very helpful. So.
Okay, maybe I'll take a step in this question as well. So I think governments are sometimes guilty of making it too easy for mines to open in their backyard. And the reason that they can be accused of that is because governments may have different regulations and standards on what is permissible for an operation. So if you look at the flip side, governments actually have the power to then put in the right kinds of regulations and standards that can ensure that the mines that are opening in their country are actually embracing the decarbonization strategies or technologies that are necessary to make things work. The other piece too about government, which I think is really important, is that government can actually provide financial aid and support to enable technologies to be adopted. They can provide incentives, again, keeps coming up, tax incentives on adoption of new technologies. But also governments can start to put in place the right level of education that their citizens should have in order to be the employees of the future. So I think that's a very important point, again, touches back on the social side as well. And I think another piece too that is maybe important to mention is that governments have the ability to enforce, whether it be monitoring to ensure that, that standards are being kept. And I think that's a really powerful tool when governments can be held accountable to maybe report on an international stage on their performance. Maybe an event like COP28, the COP events, for example, can be a good place for governments to report on, how are they actually, enforcing the different standards and regulations that can actually, ensure that technologies are being adopted as new operations open in their backyard.
Thanks, and I'll chip in a bit on this one. I think for me the role of government, and we spend a lot of time working in Africa lately, and the role of the host government actually should be able to provide stability and clarity in the decision-making processes. That's going to foster investment. A lot of the investments are at risk when the decision processes are unclear, when the path forwards or the duration of the vision is too short. When you're going to invest 20, 30-year assets in a country, you want to make sure that the legal context and framework and social context is going to be clear for that period. I think I would say more developed country should recognize the countries that do that effort and reward them with support, and or indirectly support through mitigating risk for the investors that are going to go develop projects in those countries. In the end, it's mining is a risky business. It's a technically risky business by itself. Adding political risk, adding legal risk, adding financial risk to it, it just makes the business case worse. So it has to be, I would say, a more holistic approach to how we approach this. And I'm going to use the example of Botswana. I think that has been a really good country in Africa for stability, providing usually a longer view on government, and obviously the industry there has developed fairly well as a result. So that's it.
No, thank you very much. And it's interesting, actually, the concept around stability and clarity. I mean, even in the West, I'm sort of based in the UK, and we often see major infrastructure schemes becoming a bit of an sort of an election football. So yeah, I think it's a very valid point. I think, and I suppose, Charles, your response with respect to regulation is a nice segue into the next point. We're sort of based in London, and there's a lot of discussion with the markets in London around the level of regulation, particularly as we move into a greater focus on ESG. So I mean, what's the thoughts around the role that regulation and governments play in the net zero transition, and at what point do governments need to, I suppose, back off and just let the markets and the industry innovate and move things forward? Charles, if I could maybe hand that to you initially.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think, the role that government can play is it really being an enabler and removing, any barriers to entry, especially when it comes to technologies coming in from other places, coming into the host country. I think government can make a way for that to happen a bit easier. And look, there's trade commissioner services that are work really well. Canada has something called the EDC, Economic Development Canada, the BDC, the Business Development of Canada. All these instruments are available, and they are supported by the government that can enable the made in Canada solutions to become more visible. I think outside of that, I think the different think tanks that the government can put together can also help raise the level of awareness across the country on strategies to decarbonize. Because what we find happening is that the information on how things can be done better is just that information is not disseminated enough in countries. And when you're looking at a developing country, with less connectivity and less networks, you can find that this information can exist on a mine site, and yet that information is not shared across the community. So I think there's a role that government can play there in just raising the level of knowledge and awareness of on what the standards should be, what the regulations should be in any one given country.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll add a bit to it, and I think we do a lot of financial modeling for mining and metals assets in support of our projects, our clients' project development, and it's going to be a bit on specific to decarbonization, obviously on all ESG aspects, but specific to decarbonization, policies around clarity around carbon pricing is key. A lot of the decarbonization initiatives only make sense at a certain carbon pricing level, and if there's clarity around that, then it makes the business case easy. And whenever there's a push for a carbon pricing, then hopefully keeping to the timeline is what is going to allow. We see right away that when the carbon pricing timelines fall behind, and the projects tend to follow that same trend. So again, on the theme of clarity that I was talking about a bit earlier, for me, cost of carbon clarity is a super important aspect in decarbonization.
Fantastic, thank you. So, moving on, I suppose, from regulation, in your experience, what are some of the key drivers that are sort of driving the change, the demand for change and decarbonisation of the industry, and specifically, as some of the broader shareholders, stakeholders, how are they influencing industry's decision making around decarbonisation? Roy, if I could perhaps hand over to you on that one.
Well, I think obviously there's the overriding premise of global warming and the fact that we're moving in that direction. But I think just if we look at at the end of the day, we're trying to curb climate change for the sake of the humans living on Earth and the fact that we want to live in a clean environment. And if we look at some of the countries that are still burning coal, and I think every day today, coal is increasing in use, not decreasing, unfortunately. So it's still going up. So curbing that, I think, is one of the key things. And any of us that have visited, I won't name specific countries, but if you see some of the level of pollution from heavy countries that use coal as a primary powering feedstock for their power plants, it's a tough environment to live in. And so I think that's one of the primary drivers. So I see that as a big thing. So and I think ever since the Kyoto protocols, personally for me, looking at different mechanisms around carbon capture, around reducing and moving away from using traditional coals. And listen, there's lots of technologies out there around using clean coal, whether it's pre-combustion capture or if different types of converting coal into types of synthetic fuels that can be where you can capture the carbon and get it out. So there are means of it. So it's not just a shot just at fossil fuels and coal, because I think there's a legitimate trend where we're going to get to a cleaner and a net zero projection where we were using clean fossil fuels as well. But I think that's the primary push that I see behind it. I think it's just the types of fuels that we're using today need to change, or at least the way we're combusting them, for sure.
Yeah, I can add some points on this question. So the green transition, the energy transition, the just transition that we're going through, the desire for low carbon economy, what it's doing is actually forcing the mining industry to produce more minerals and metals. But in order for us to have, the EVs that we have, or the battery storage capacities that we want to have, or even have the solar panels or wind generation that we want, we need to produce these things using minerals and metals. And the mining industry is on the conscience side, just doesn't want to produce all these clean minerals, this clean energy, minerals and metals in a dirty way. So the industry itself is questioning itself to say, hey, we don't want to keep producing things in a way that is energy efficient, that is not clean and green. So the industry itself is becoming green so that we can truly have net zero, right? So, because one of the challenges that we're seeing is that if we say we have, clean technology in terms of the equipment that we have, but yet how we made that equipment was using bad technology, that makes us a bit of a hypocrite, right? Because so it's almost like we're saying yes to net zero, but we're actually not being net zero ourselves. So the mining industry itself wants to become net zero so that it can produce the minerals and metals needed by the world in as clean a way as possible. So I think that is a big driver.
I'll add a bit on this. I think it's also for me the concept of social license to operate. Now, I think the mining and metals companies are, yes, they want to produce, but because they want social acceptability. And I'm just going to use our own case. Young people that work, or my children, would not want to work in a environmentally damaging industry. So and it's been a challenge to attract people working in industries that are seen as not environmentally progressive. So I think the companies understand that there's a social pressure to do that, and to remain relevant in today's society, they have to adapt to times and modernize their processes. So for me, it's a response to a social push that they're doing this, and it's good. I think that's these companies should operate in a way that is acceptable to society.
Yes, thank you, JD. And certainly, I mean, I think one of the things we're particularly proud of at Hatch is an awful lot of the work that we do is all about sort of embedding social value in a lot of the projects that we work on. And I suppose, could I just put that back to the panel in terms of, what sort of opportunities do you see in the transition towards decarbonisation, in terms of how organisations can actually proactively embed social value, socioeconomic growth in the work that they're doing? JD, if I could.
Well, so it's a super interesting question, and the reality is at Hatch we're a group of engineers, so we always use a technology angle. We like technology. That's our thing, and we try to promote it. We push it, but I think it's also about creating safe, sustainable employment, minimizing the impacts on communities that we do, and all of that. For us, obviously, as I said, we take the technological lens to all of these things, but and that would be a really good one. I think the mining and metals companies themselves need to take a much longer view on their impact than they do now, with the closure costs that are starting to be incorporated in projects from even the pre-project stages. I think that's a very important thing. But keep researching, keep implementing, keep improving. I think that's the way that we contribute. So having a technical approach. It doesn't seem to me, from a personal, to increase energy transition. As Charles said, there's an increased demand on minerals, or there's two ways. Either you increase the demand on minerals or reduce consumption. And it seems that our people have chosen that increasing mineral consumption is the better approach, or at least in many cases. So so if we're going to do that, then technology is the way to go for us.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think the whole idea of embedding the social values in as we transition, responsible sourcing is one thing that's really important for companies to consider when they're, acquiring, whether they're procuring inventories or they're procuring services. Or I think that's one area that is important, the sustainable sourcing. Another area is a community engagement. Is just going to the community and speaking to the community and engaging them as we are thinking about implementing any sort of decarbonization strategy that will impact operations in their area. Another area is just using green technologies. I think when an operation, for example, installs solar panels in a community, they're sending a message to the whole community that that they're embracing these renewables. And there's been stories of communities that have started using solar panels on their own homes because the mining company started doing it first. Another area is just the whole idea around the ethical supply chains, making sure that that you're not buying input materials from rogue nations. Okay, I think that's another one. And unfortunately, depending on who you want to call a rogue nation, there are dependencies that have been created where you have no choice but to go to a nation to get supplies. Another one too is workforce development, making sure that you're developing the workforce in the area that you're working in. That's really critical. And then when companies invest money in innovation and research, whether a company invest in having a research chair that is attached to their company name in a certain community or a university, that all goes a long way. And then the last piece is just collaboration. Just doing a lot more collaboration in how projects develop is another way of embedding the social values in how we transition towards decarbonization.
I think great points already said, but I think that just the time that we live in now and the social awareness that we have in the communities where we're doing projects, it's not enough that we go and even within Hatch, our manifesto always says that we have to bring positive change to any of the projects that we're working on. It's not enough to help create jobs in the community. It's not enough anymore to just help develop the economy better. The citizens, the individuals living around those projects have to have a level of comfort that their kids and their generations that are going to come after them are going to have an environment around them that's going to be either better or the same given this project and given these additional jobs. So I think it's a new paradigm for us. That social awareness there, it really does have a value on our projects. You could have a great business case. It could be great for the community from jobs, but it has to actually show that it's going to be a net benefit for them. And green technologies, making sure that the impact is as minimal as possible, or even adding a benefit in some way, that has to be there.
Fantastic, thank you. I think one of the sort of final questions I guess I had was that there's quite a lot of discussion at the moment surrounding difficulties, particularly with hard to abate industries, in terms of capturing, reporting, understanding Scope 3 emissions. And in some areas, I guess there's a level of sort of cynicism towards the industry that they're putting it into the too hard basket and maybe not being ambitious enough. So I guess my question to you is your reflection on some of the challenges faced by the industry in some of those pressures around reporting and the sort of pressure to transition towards net zero, but also what can be done. Surely there must be things that can be done even though there's difficulties in play. Roy, if I could perhaps hand over to you initially, please.
I love Scope 3 questions. It's always easy, but listen, I think we attended a function last night, and somebody made a statement that we want to find good solutions that come quick, but they can't be they can't be solutions that are, let's say, if we have a framework that has some gray area around it, that's pushing, and we don't want to have solutions that are, let's say, half baked, and that, we're trying to get over a hump now, but it really doesn't solve the real problem if we maybe sit back and look at a proper framework for it. So I think that we have to take the long-term view on some of these technologies. And I know some, there's a lot of, as I said earlier, very aggressive targets that we have to meet, and we do have to push ourselves. It's not trying to take the pressure off, but sometimes where we do see solutions that are maybe being fast-tracked down a specific path, and you see it. I'll take an example in hydrogen to a certain extent. People are trying to scale up specific technologies that maybe should only be scaled up to a certain size, and they're trying to be pushed up because capacities are asking. People are looking for, gigawatts and tons of hydrogen, and specific types of electrolyzers are probably not suited for that specific type of technology, and they're still trying to be fast tracked. And you're going to see, a lot of startups that are taking some of these different government incentives and monies, and unfortunately fail in some cases. Whereas, if we take a paradigm towards some of the developments around SMRs, small modular reactors, which have taken a much longer term view, their development looks far more robust in some of the developments, and they're gonna be able to scale up faster in some cases and be able to be deployed and used to help the electrification of different sectors that need it a lot quicker than, say, some hydrogen side. And it's not shooting down hydrogen, because there's lots of excellent technologies that are out there that are working and that are moving, but you see in all these different areas where they're trying to meet some specific target a little quicker, it's driving some behaviors that that are based on more short and medium term views that I think are not gonna help get us to where we want for the final goal.
Yeah, I just wanted to use, how maybe sometimes we're letting the emitters getting a bit easy depending on the scopes. And I'm going to use the example of the aluminum industry, which is known to me. So the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism for the aluminum industry is only it's going to consider scope 1. Which means that 80% of the emissions related to aluminum production is actually not going to be considered in the carbon border adjustment. So if we're only going to consider 20% of the emissions, then really we're not there's no bite in what we're putting, and there's therefore no incentive to promoters that are developing green solutions. At the moment in Canada, we're in the aluminum industry is developing a fully I would say zero emission technology for the reduction process. But really, aluminum emission come mostly from the power generation that is associated with it. So I think I think we need to maybe push that a little further to really see the change happening.
Yeah, we work with a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises that provide services to the mining industry, and a lot of the small companies don't have the ability or the knowledge inside their companies to do any kind of a carbon accounting, to actually understand their own emissions and how they're contributing. So what we find happening now is that there's a lot of education that's actually starting to happen, where these vendors are starting to get knowledge on, how they're contributing towards the broader emission, by them understanding better how their processes are, where they're sourcing their raw materials, how are they putting it together, how are they delivering the solution to the different operations that they're servicing. So I think what we'll see happening in the future is that as people get more aware of how they're emitting, then they'll find ways to mitigate some of those emissions. It's a little bit scary though to think, if you do the carbon accounting on some of the products and services that we use on a daily basis, we may be pleasantly surprised that it's actually higher than we think. So we see this happening in the mining industry, where those scope 3 emissions, which are really hard to measure, and part of the reason why they're hard to measure is because, number one, no one actually knows how to measure in those smaller companies, but it is starting to happen.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so just I suppose one very final question, and maybe if I could just ask each of you to just respond really quickly. Is there any sort of emerging technologies that you're particularly excited about coming to market, JD?
Well, personally, I'm again a little biased towards, but I think for years the electrolysis technology and metal smelting has been put aside. I think there's a lot of potential in this, providing that we can support it with green energy. But that allows to remove oxygen from a lot of minerals without using carbon to do it, and therefore reducing carbon emissions. So I'm a big fan of electrolysis, and I think it's gonna, over the next decade, we're gonna see more of it.
Yeah, I mean, I started by just saying, the direct lithium extraction technology by lighters is definitely one, for sure. That's exciting. But others include, the use of small modular nuclear reactors. I think that's going to make a big difference, especially when you think about how the developing world it really is an energy poverty. And that energy poverty creates a whole bunch of other problems that I think we're seeing. And then maybe another technology that I want to throw out is that anything that is biotechnology related that can help us to reduce the dependency on reagents that are bad for the environment, like the cyanides, the mercuries, and all the other acids that are used in mineral extraction. Biotechnology is going to remove that. So the nature-based solutions is a trend that I think is important.
So I'll maybe touch on two, and I touched on them briefly earlier. So I think in around green steel and moving steel industry away from blast furnaces and taking them to a DR route and using technologies around smelting furnaces to help do that is a great technology, something that Hatch is very involved in. Another technology I think is where the capture technologies around carbon are advancing, and they're at a point where their maturity is there. From a sequestration standpoint, there's still a lot of unknowns. I have a background in reservoir engineering as well, and I can tell you that it's not a finite science, but there are great places to sequester in the world, and other places there aren't. So there are technologies where you can actually take carbon and convert it to a solid, and that's the only true way to sequester it. And that's, a lot of respect for our CEO. He's a true process engineer, and he's like, the only way to truly sequester is to turn it to a solid. And there are technologies now that are being developed to take any captured carbon and convert it to a solid. And those are groundbreaking, and I'll be watching those very closely.
Okay, well, terrific. Thank you very much. I mean, it's been a very interesting panel discussion, so thank you all very much for your contributions. I think certainly we can see many challenges ahead with some very ambitious targets in front of us as an industry. There is still quite a deal of uncertainty out there in the future, but it's very exciting to see us moving ahead in a sort of a global trajectory and in a socially conscious way. So finally, I'd just like to thank CRIN for the opportunity to present today. It's been terrific. We're really enjoying COP28. And thank you all very much for your time. Thank you.